Welcome back to CannaWeek, brought to you by New Frontier Data, where we deliver the week's top headlines in cannabis and hear experts weigh in on the impacts these stories are having on the industry. I'm your host, Heather Wickline. Our first guest is a serial entrepreneur, brand builder, networker, and award-winning journalist. She has been active in the cannabis industry since 2014 as an investor and co-founder of MJI News. Currently, she's a board member of Manifest 7, a fully licensed logistics network and compliant distribution and retail channels across California. Please welcome Kristin Fox. Thanks so much for being here today.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
And our next guest has 20 years experience as an entrepreneur, has launched and operated 4 data-driven businesses, and is considered an expert in strategic positioning and risk management in emerging high growth markets. Please welcome our founder and CEO of New Frontier Data, Giadha DeCarcer.
Great to be back.
Great to have you back. Before we get started, Kristin, I couldn't even touch on all of the different projects you're working on and different pots you have your hand in. Before we get started, could you just familiarize our guests with what you're working on right now?
Well, right now, my primary focus in the cannabis industry is as a board member for Manifest 7. And as we know, the industry has changed substantially over the years. I got into it in 2014, which is when Giadha and I first met in Colorado, just shortly after 420. And so for me, the exciting part is to see how things have changed. And the way that I got to Manifest 7 was early on, at the time I met Giadha, I had formed MJI News with another member of the cannabis industry, and it was really focused on helping investors understand how do you get into this industry, because then it was very different than it is now. And after about a year, we sold that business to MJIC, which at the time was really more of a business development corporation. And it really kind of tracks the evolution of the industry, because now Manifest 7 is a full-blown omnichannel for the industry. And so that's kind of my history for getting into this.
Well, that's perfect, because you're going to have lots to contribute today. Well, we have lots to cover, so we'll dive right in. Last week, the Chicago Tribune reported optimism in cannabis investing exists even amid a global pandemic. So this article really broke down the investing conundrum. Where do you invest in an industry with enormous projected growth and opportunity, but where many companies are yet to show a profit? And as we've discussed many times here, how do you navigate an industry that's been deemed essential in certain states during this global pandemic, but is still legal on a federal level? So this is welcome to the wonderful world of cannabis investing. Nonetheless, this industry is proving to be relatively pandemic resistant. More and more people are looking to the industry to diversify and insulate their portfolios, since the economic future is really unknown at this point. So Kristin, how would you characterize the private investment landscape in the current cannabis industry?
Right now, I think that people are intrigued, and like everything else that they're doing, they're cautiously optimistic. So there's a lot of people who are beginning to kick the tires. There are a lot of investors who are doubling and even tripling down on original investments, and people who are trying to figure out just how do you get into this business and where are the best possibilities.
Right. Now, Giadha, you're very familiar with the private investment landscape. What are your thoughts on it?
Well, I could not agree more with Kristin. What's interesting is in terms of how I see it, is that we're seeing a sort of a new wave of investors coming in. And I do agree that they're very cautious right now, because, however, it is beginning to show sort of the recession-proof element. I think what we're beginning to see is more and more investors sort of dipping their toes and coming in. Now, that's on the private side. I don't know if I'm yet allowed to talk about the public side. No,
please. I was going to go right into that, please.
Because, and this was actually surprising to me. In the middle of the recession, right, or ongoing recession, pandemic, whichever crisis you want to pick at the time, at this current time, one would think that investors would sort of be a little more cautious on the public side and sort of try to go into the private side. But what the data has been showing recently is quite the opposite, that over 80% of capital raises have actually been within the public market. In fact, the last number that I've got is that 88%, so almost 90% of money, of actual amounts raised, have gone into the public market. That to me is a very interesting phenomena. I'm not really sure how I can explain it. In fact, if I may, I would throw it back at Kristin. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think it's one of, there are two segments of investors. There are the people who invest from nothing but the private perspective. And also the accredited investors. And then there are people who it's almost impossible to find yield in a lot of places right now. And this is an interesting market. And for some people who don't fall in the accredited investor category, the public markets is one place where they can put money. On the private sector side, I think we see a lot more money coming in. That's a little harder to track. And you don't see, there are no databases, there's something for you, on the private investment side. So I think I would be inclined to say that it's probably about equal, maybe even more coming in from private investors because, as I said before, we see people coming in and doubling down, tripling down on their investments and saying, okay, we have a winning sector. There's a great deal of potential here. And you also see the industry is really growing up. It's changing. And I know from the Manifest 7 perspective, as we've gone out and talked to investors, one of the things that they appreciate is that in this next and future generation of cannabis, what you've got are people who are tried and true entrepreneurs. So when you and I first met in 2014, this really was the Wild West and people were just throwing money at anything and everything. But now we can start to see how the industry is evolving. We've seen what works and what doesn't work. And it's really been tested by fire when it comes to the pandemic, because not only did you have the challenge of, oh, okay, you were an essential business, but each state put individual regulations on businesses that were essential. So not only did you have to survive as a small and growing business, but you had to navigate things that nobody's had to navigate before. So private investors are coming back and saying, okay, you lived through the fire. What else could possibly happen that you can't live through? And maybe I better not tempt fate with
alien invasion. I wouldn't, right.
No murder wasps, please.
I know, I was going to say the murder hornets. Oh, my God.
But I really do think that the businesses that are out there have been so tested in the last 3 months that investors who might not have been quite so comfortable are saying, you know what, these people really know how to run business. And it may not be that the normal metrics apply, but normal metrics don't apply to anything anymore.
Right. Well, how would you recommend for investors to even seek out these opportunities for a private investment?
I think it's really, in the same way that we would do it in normal times. On the private investment side, I will admit that I am not a big fan of angel groups, partly because from a personal level, when you go into an angel group and you see all these presentations, it's far too many shiny things. And it's really easy to get distracted. I think that the best way to invest, particularly in an industry like this, is to look at the businesses that you have in front of you, or, for example, things that you know to have been successful. Talk to other investors. Say, okay, where have you been? What do you like? And when you do start kicking the tires of the business, go to them and say, you know what, give me references.
Right. I feel like the lack of conferences and the lack of networking and, the interaction with people face-to-face kind of makes it a little more difficult. Just being able to, reach out to other people or just I don't know, I guess the networking aspect of being at these face-to-face big conferences, you get to meet and see new companies, new people.
Yeah, I think that has changed things, but the other thing too is that the ones who are out there and who are doing business and doing well now, most of these companies are raising money. Everybody is. One of the great challenges is how do you stay alive in an environment like this? And so by going to the people who exist and who appear to be thriving and doing due diligence, I think that's really your best opportunity at this point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we've had a couple of, operators and multi-state operators on here that everybody's just in survival mode. It's just trying to survive this time, and it's going to flush out a lot of people that may have looked successful or going on, but their books weren't really in line. Giadha, what is your thought on this as far as investors seeking out for companies that aren't publicly traded?
So, I was following closely what Kristin was saying. It's interesting, especially when you look at the regional perspective. Where are they coming from? What we've perceived sort of firsthand on the New Frontier Data side is that we're beginning to see some interest from what we consider non-traditional cannabis investors. So to the point that Kristin made, that companies that are doing well are getting the attention. And so investors are leaning towards more visible brands, more visible companies. With that goes that indeed, right, we are now on month 3, month 4, I can't even tell anymore, of the pandemic. Companies that are continuing to stay afloat and doing it are showing that kind of resilience that I would expect, like Kristin said, is attractive to an investor. I remember when I first started, people used to say, you invest in people, you don't invest in companies, especially when it's a startup, because it's all about the execution. So there's certainly something to that right now through this pandemic. If you can show that you have the flexibility, the creativity, and the resilience to make it through this and stay afloat, candidly, yes, we're relatively fortunate in the cannabis industry because of this, being essential businesses in the US or North America, and potentially recession-proof. But nonetheless, it hasn't been a walk in the park by any stretch of the imagination, no matter what industry you're in. And so I think that type of sort of being able to sort of withstand that, and it's probably attractive to an investor. What I would say though is that the investments that I have seen and that we have seen tend to be larger investment that we've seen in the past, and from companies that you wouldn't necessarily expect to be in. So the likes of the CPGs. So literally product companies, brand companies coming in to sort of make those large investments versus sort of the traditional VC, the traditional family offices, et cetera, who seem to be holding back a little more. But again, I agree with Kristin. I mean, we're in the data business. I just quoted earlier that 80%, I should give credit what credit is due. That was the Viridian tracker, the deal tracker. It is extremely challenging right now to get a true visibility into where these investments are going. I mean, it's usually difficult and challenging period in the cannabis space. It's still, transparency. We're all working towards further transparency. We're not there yet. So, take it all with a grain of salt.
Right. Well, as far as just a last question about just as far as investors, Kristin, what do you think as far as some verticals within the industry that investors can look to for real long-term growth?
I think distribution is always the key, no matter what industry you're in. It's always about how do you distribute a product. And there will be lots of different kinds of products that come along, and there will be lots of flavors of the month, particularly in the cannabis industry. That's just kind of the nature of the beast. But what's really enduring and what will make the industry grow, and is also replicable, is the entire concept of distribution. How does it get from the grower to the store to the individual? And without that infrastructure, which is crucial in any industry, then you don't have a business.
Right. Giadha, would you agree with that?
100%. But when do I not agree with Kristin? Pretty much defer to her on all things. But it's really interesting that you mentioned that. So Amazon started distributing CBD products, right? We know that. What I found fascinating of that is if you think of the structure that we have in the United States, where it's sort of siloed by states, it's challenging for multi-state operators to have that distribution because they kind of have to set it locally in every place. Truly, the scalability of it it's a burden to scale. The Amazons of the world, who have the infrastructure in every single corner of the city, the county, the state, certainly could have a massive advantage if they begin to carry sort of brands products. So right now it's only CBD, obviously it's not high THC products, but it is interesting certainly that Amazon would enter. Back to the question, Kristin, do they agree with you? Do they see the writing on the wall, the distribution is the key to the future of the cannabis industry?
Well, I certainly hope so, because at Manifest 7, we're considering ourselves the omni-channel of distribution. So for where my money and my mind is, yes, that's exactly what I want.
There you go.
Well, there it is. Well, I'm happy that hopefully that will be, that'll prove true. Well, moving along, recently Forbes published an article, Cannabis Solution Providers Usher in a New Era of Mainstream Marketing. So Giadha, as you mentioned before, with these CPG companies coming in, it really highlights how lucrative this potential of cannabis consumer data is, and it really can't be overlooked by mainstream companies anymore. And access to this valuable consumer data has been a major challenge, and also has been, the data that's out there is really outdated. The typical cannabis consumer today is a far cry from, a kid in a tie-dye t-shirt in their parents' basement. They're just a lot more sophisticated. So I know New Frontier Data's Next Tech solution really is something that, as new on the scene, there allows for this effective marketing and brand development for operators who are looking to build brand recognition and stand out from the competition. So Kristin, since you have a big, past in brand development and brand building, what are your thoughts on the large brands entering the industry?
I think that that's a natural progression to the growth of the industry. One of the reasons that I got into cannabis is that I love the proverbial new frontier. I also love the Giadha named the data company that. One of the first businesses that I built was in the hedge fund industry. And when I got into the hedge fund industry in 1993, there were only 70 funds and everything was done by introduction. And my background was in building a database and ultimately an information system that went around that database. And watching an industry grow from that nascent business to larger things, when all of a sudden, at one point you couldn't even find a definition of a hedge fund, and the next second the banks all had platforms offering them. And I think that you're seeing the same sort of thing in the cannabis industry. And the reality is, and I've heard a lot of people complain about, the big companies are coming in, but they bring money with them. And in order to grow this industry, it needs that kind of gravitas. It needs the big brand name recognition. That doesn't mean that there aren't opportunities for smaller companies, because those smaller companies are nimble, they're smart, they understand the industry in a way that the larger companies won't. But it also means that there's room for them to become the bigger movers in that business. So Giadha has always said since the day I met her that she wanted to be the Bloomberg of cannabis data, which anytime you've got data from inception on an industry, you're sitting on something that's really intriguing. And you also grow up in that industry and have a way to understand it that other people don't. So I think that this brings in an interesting balance, and it's an important one. I don't think that the big companies are going to come in and take over the cannabis business and squash everybody. I think there's room and opportunity from each player.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like from a lot of these smaller companies that have been building, they can tell them firsthand there's a lot to learn in this business. And it's not as easy as coming into a mature market that's already been established. Giadha, what are your thoughts as far as, what you seeing brands evolve in the industry and the larger brands coming in?
So to Kristin's point, I think it will propel it forward. right? I mean, we were talking earlier about what type of investment is coming in. These big brands, these larger brands are making investments, and not just monetary investment, but they're investing resources. And they bring in the knowledge, the experience, the know-how, the infrastructure. Those are things that will help the industry as a whole sort of propel forward into the next step. We've seen with food and beverage and health and beauty sort of embracing the CBD, the CBD products in general. Begs the question of what is next. Of course, we know that tobacco and alcohol have been sniffing around, pharmaceutical, of course, also looking, but truly when you're thinking about those big brands, it truly falls in that food and beverage and health and beauty and CBD. So I think it's a good thing. I also agree that it doesn't necessarily mean that the smaller companies are going to be squished. Strength in numbers. You know, a lot of the smaller player in the industry are looking, especially during this economic environment, are looking for sort of, you know, that help to sustain. The alternative is implosion. No one wants that. And there is a lot of talent that can be, I don't want to say rescued, but certainly capitalized, leveraged, and sort of brought together to sort of take the industry to the next step.
Right. Well, I'll put this out to both of you. What do you think, what kind of steps can companies make that, to, you know, ensure that they remain relevant and, you know, as the industry continues to evolve, how they can stay in front of the customer?
It's two-pronged, because part of me would say, don't keep doing the same thing, because you have to grow and evolve, but you still have to stay true to who you are at the same time. And, you know, people who are loyal to your brand initially are going to stay loyal to your brand because they believe in you. But it's really about looking at new opportunities. And that's really, that isn't just a cannabis thing, that's an entrepreneur thing. And that's something that I've seen over the years as an investor and as a founder. People who get stuck don't survive. Mm-hmm. And particularly now, you have to be really nimble, and you have to show that you can survive and get creative.
Well, we've seen that. I mean, we've seen people get creative with the online ordering and all the different things that had to come out of, you know, this pandemic of curbside pickup and this and that, where they were definitely not set up for that, these brick and mortars. So I feel like already we've seen this industry be very nimble, be very flexible and responsive. So it seems like they do need to hang on to what their core beliefs are, but keep evolving, keep being better. Giadha, would you agree or anything to add?
So we had a survey, we ran a survey recently, and it showed that over 50% of CBD users, going back to CBD, but CBD users stick to what they know. So that's good and bad, right? In terms of sort of newcomers trying to be creative and nimble, it certainly does, it could be a challenge, because if the consumer is sort of going back to what he or she knows and is not trying new things, then how do you get in front of them? I mean, part of the reason that we launched Next Tech is sort of to address that, right? And we have these big brands that are coming in that may be known outside of the cannabis consumption, right? I mean, you know, I'm just going to use examples: the Nestle's, the Garniers, the Doritos. But they want to figure out how exactly how do you align that product, that new product, with that specific the consumer that is going to be most likely to adopt it. It goes down to data, right? I did say we wanted to be the Bloomberg of cannabis. Now we want to be the Bloomberg and the Nielsen.
Dream big. We got to dream big.
The other thing that I would add to that is, right now, we're seeing a lot of M&A activity in the cannabis space. And I think that smaller companies should be open to the idea that maybe it's time to sell. And I've seen that with in other industries as well, where a small company is so adamant that they are going to grow organically that they kill themselves because they won't look at opportunities. And it might be that there are, and I'm just throwing this out there as a complete hypothetical, but it could be that there are 3 CBD companies that are extremely complementary that would do better as one. So maybe it's time to look at, even if you're a small company, there are ways to acquire your competitors. And thinking about how you're going to grow, I think is probably one of the most important things right now. And it's not just about growing. At this point, it's about survival.
Surviving.
Exactly, yeah.
I could not agree more. I could not agree more. There's a certain element as an entrepreneur, right? And you know this, Kristin, there's a little bit of sort of, I don't want to say ego, but it's your baby, right? You sort of, you stuck to it. It comes to a point where you have to embrace the next step. And given the economic condition, I could not agree more that you're looking at opportunities to bring together companies to make more, embrace those economies of scales. It's cost savings, right? It means you're sharing infrastructure. That means that you can scale better. That means that you can grow, you can sustain your growth, you can survive and even succeed, as long as you're willing to sort of give up a little to win a lot. And there's always that first step that is sort of uncomfortable, but let's think of the alternative. The alternative is not a great one, right? So I agree 100%.
Well, this is awesome. I think this is a great place to leave it for today. But if either of you have any final thoughts or advice for our listeners, I would love for you to pass that on now.
Well, I do want to say one thing.
Please.
Wasn't mentioned. I don't know if people know that Kristin Fox was one of the first 100 women in hedge fund. So, which is quite, I mean, listen, to me, it was so humbling to first, you know, when I first got the full story, because Kristin is actually pretty humble herself, she never talks about it. But you have to understand that, you know, we talk about challenges that women and entrepreneur face, and then the challenges of having come so early into the cannabis industry. Kristin, you're a woman who's faced those head on. And having been one of the first 100 women in hedge fund in probably the hardest and harshest environment to really crack the nut as a woman. No wonder you came in early in the cannabis industry. It was a walk in the park. So I just wanted to bring that up and commend you and say that, you know, it's an inspiration. It is every day.
Well, the secret's out. Kristin is a badass.
Oh, yeah.
And Kristin, any final thoughts from you for our listeners?
At this point, I think we're at such an extraordinary moment in the cannabis industry, and there is so much potential out there. You know, back to thank you, Giadha, for the kind words. I am old enough to have been a pioneer in a number of industries. But one thing I do think is that there's an extraordinary opportunity for women in the cannabis industry. And I would really encourage you to go for it. I know that Giadha has not had an easy road. It's been 6 going on 7 years, and through
Feels
some
like
extraordinary things. And yes, we're having a mutual admiration society here. But, you know, you're an example of someone who has been nimble and who has had big dreams. And it's the same thing, you know, when I'm going to put in a shameless plug for the M7 crowd, because those guys have done exactly the same thing. There have been countless obstacles, and the cannabis industry has more obstacles than other places because, of course, there's the federal issues. Gee, you happen to be operating in an illegal industry. And then you've got the fact that there's no banking and a lot of other things. But there's tremendous success here. And there's a real will to succeed. And I would encourage investors to take a really good, hard look at this industry, because I think it's at an interesting tipping point. And there are very few times in your life that you will come across something that is really a frontier. And that's what this is. And I think that right now, because we're at the inflection point between version 1.0 and version 2.0 of cannabis, and I think that the real money, now is the time to make it. And the people who have been in it and have proven their businesses at this point. They've been through the fire. And I think it's time to start writing some checks. That's it.
Well said. Well said.
Very well said.
Write those checks.
What you said.
Well, this has been great. Thank you all for joining us at CannaWeek. Please be sure to like and subscribe to the podcast. You can find these news stories and more on New Frontier Data's Cannabis Insights Daily. And if you'd like to check out more about Next Tech Solutions, you can go to our website, newfrontierdata.com/NXTECK. Ladies, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much. This was fun. And I hope you all have a great day.